Hey folks, my name is Cooper, and I am here to talk about the Luka Doncic trade. Quite possibly biggest trade, the biggest NBA transaction of the century, maybe the greatest NBA transaction of all time. Certainly one of the most controversial transactions that I've ever seen, and the one that stirred the most emotions within me. It certainly had me riled up all day. Um, I'm sure all of you have seen at this point, but Luka was traded for Anthony Davis, Max Christie, and the 2029 first round pick from the Los Angeles Lakers. Luka will now be a Laker. The Lakers have done it again somehow. Don't let this Lakers jersey fool you. I am in South Carolina. I'm not a Lakers fan. My dad grew up in LA, so I guess I'm a Lakers fan now. Um, but the Lakers, again, acquired Luka, also got Maxi Kleber and Markieff Morris. But for all intents and purposes, this trade was Luka for Anthony Davis. The discussion really isn't even about who won this trade, who lost this trade, or whether either side should have made it. Those answers are pretty obvious. This is a heist by the Lakers. This is that word is overused, but this is a heist. This is an absolute robbery by the Lakers. They just got one of the best players in the NBA, a guy that's on track to win a title, win multiple titles, win multiple MVPs, be one of the greatest NBA players of all time potentially. And the Mavericks just got 30-year-old Anthony Davis, who has consistently missed 30 to 40 games in most of his seasons. He had a very healthy season last year, but he is consistently an injury risk and is only getting older. And is just not a number one lead type of player, whereas Luka has proven himself to be a lead player every season of his entire career. Um, the real question is not whether this was a win for the Lakers, it was, a loss for the Mavericks, it was, or whether, again, either side should have made this trade. The Lakers should every single time. The Mavericks should never, not in a million scenarios. There's no scenario Doctor Strange could have foreseen where this made sense. Um, the real question is this the worst trade in NBA history? And frankly, is it the worst trade in all of American professional sports? Because um, it's truly appalling. I feel like Stephen A. Smith with the words I want to use. It's preposterous. It's astonishing. Um, so the best way for me to look at this, everybody's going to have their way of talking about this. Again, I'm not the first person to talk about this trade. I'm not the most qualified person to talk about this trade. But the way that I wanted to go through it was by making some comparisons, drawing upon the past. Again, I think that the real question to be answered right here is, and this is an impossible question to answer at the time. Luka's 25. This trade just happened. Um, we can't really determine, is this the worst trade of all time, right? That's a very frankly silly thing to say anyways. But I think what we can look at is, at the time this decision was made, how does this stack up in terms of the worst decisions made, and how does this compare to some of the worst transactions that we've seen in NBA history, or at least maybe another way to put it is the most lopsided transactions in NBA history. I'm not going to talk about something like the Nets trading for Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett. I'm looking more at instances where a great player was acquired for a very poor return, especially great players that were traded earlier or mid of their career, right? I'm not really talking about Scottie Pippen to the Trailblazers. That's another trade that's not a comparison to this, right? Luka's 25 years old. He just came off of 5 straight All-NBA first team appearances. He just came off of the finals. He just took his team to the finals. We're not talking about Scottie Pippen at age 35 or whatever it was, right? We're not talking about Barkley to the Rockets, okay? This is a completely different caliber of trade. So the comparisons that I picked out, I sorted into 3 different categories. So the first one is players that were traded as draft picks. Obviously, this correlates pretty well in terms of the young players, this being very early in their career. However, especially with these first 2 comparisons, they don't really hold the same. They don't hold much weight with me because specifically, and I'll go ahead and get into it, but these first 2 guys were traded before they even had any NBA experience, and were not traded specifically for a player. They were speculative picks. So the first was Kyrie Irving. Kyrie was traded, or at least the pick that was eventually used to select Kyrie was traded from the Clippers to the Cavaliers in 2011. That trade was made for Baron Davis to more or less save money. Baron Davis was amnestied because Donald Sterling is not only racist and a moron, but he's a clown and doesn't know how to run basketball teams. May he rest in hell. This was a pick that had a very low chance. It was a straight up unprotected first round pick for Baron Davis, which was a foolish decision at the time, but should have ended up being a foolish decision that ended with the Cavs getting the 13th or the 14th or maybe the 12th overall pick, right? This pick had very low odds of jumping into the top, and it just happened to do so. So the Cavaliers got really lucky, got a ton of lottery luck, the first of many that has happened with the Cavs. But this, again, it was not for Kyrie Irving, and the odds of the Cavs getting this pick when they made this trade were very low to begin with. The second example I came up with in terms of draft picks was James Worthy. This was another one where the pick was traded in a speculative manner. This one was actually far further out. This did not come through lottery luck, so I think it is worth noting that the Jazz were simply the worst team in the league. But the Jazz traded their 1982 pick to the Lakers in the 1980 season. The return was some middling players. The goal for the Jazz was actually to get players to improve their team, which obviously they did not do very well. But this was, again, a speculative play by the Lakers acquiring a first-round pick that just happened to turn into the number one overall pick 2 years later. And they were able to get James Worthy and add him to a already championship caliber team alongside Magic and Kareem. The third draft pick example that I picked up was one that I think fits a lot better into this. This was Bill Russell. Bill Russell was traded on draft day as opposed to being traded, as opposed to the draft selection that he was taken with being traded earlier. So this was not a speculative transaction. This was a direct transaction where the St. Louis Hawks traded the pick that they used on Bill Russell directly to the Boston Celtics. This is possibly the greatest or the best return, certainly out of these draft picks, but maybe out of this whole exercise that I looked into. The Hawks received Ed McCauley and Cliff Hagan in return for Bill Russell. Ed McCauley and Cliff Hagan are both Hall of Famers. They are both great players. Again, when you played in the 50s, you had a lot less competition for All-Star spots, All-NBA spots, in the Hall of Fame as well. But they were both great players in their time. Ed McCauley was a pretty huge flop. He was, I believe, 28 when he was traded, but only played 2 more full seasons, one an All-Star and one a serviceable starter for the Hawks. But Cliff McCauley was a great addition for the Hawks. He was traded, I believe, as a rookie. Maybe it was in his second season. But he made 5 All-Star teams with the Hawks and was the second best player on the Hawks title team in 1957. So overall, a great player for the Hawks, one of their greatest historical players. But obviously, those two are nothing compared to the greatness of Bill Russell. Bill was, Bill, like I'm friends with him. Mr. Russell, Bill Russell, was very established coming out of college. He came out of the University of San Francisco, sort of turned them into, during the time he was there, a powerhouse. They won 2 titles under him. He was the best player in college basketball. He was sort of the undisputed number 1 pick in his year, 1956, and went on to be obviously one of the greatest players in NBA history. Won 11 titles, made 11 All-NBA teams, won 5 MVPs, several Defensive Player of the Years, and is generally regarded, and I would easily say, is one of the top 10 NBA players of all time. I would probably have him around 5th or 6th on my personal list, but I think that it's indisputable that he's a top 10 NBA player and pretty reasonable to put him in your top 5. He was 22 when he got traded. Obviously, he was a senior. This was a time when not only were players not coming into the NBA early, they weren't even playing for their varsity college teams their first year. So he came out as a 22-year-old. So I think this is one of the better comparisons. I think actually the second best comparison that I came up with, because he was a very clearly established player when he was traded. Again, the difference being he had not even played a single minute in the NBA, let alone play 5 All-NBA first-team seasons like Luka Doncic had, and having 2 conference finals and 1 finals run, which Luka Doncic had. But at the same time, it was pretty apparent that he was going to be a great NBA player. In the era, again, in the late 50s when he was drafted, a 6'10" guy that was an elite athlete was pretty hard to come by, especially one with the mindset that Bill Russell had. So you could be pretty confident in projecting him to be a Hall of Famer. That's why he had so much draft hype. That's why the Celtics gave up so much for him. Red Auerbach gave up so much for him. But that being said, he did not have the pedigree that Luka did. Again, just because he didn't have the professional experience yet. Frankly, I would say that he wasn't even close to having the pedigree that Luka does. Again, just because Luka has such an established track record of performance in the NBA, which is, again, the league that Russell was drafted to play in, but had not even played a second in the second, or at the time that he was traded. So that's the first category of draft picks. I think that, again, Bill Russell is a pretty good comparison here, but doesn't quite match up. The next list, this is the 3 players that demanded a trade, sort of forced their way out of their incumbent teams. So, again, similar parallels, which is why I want to talk about them, but Luka, for at least what's been told to us, has not demanded a trade or even asked for one. And especially in this modern era where everything is leaked, everything is on social media, it's pretty unlikely that Luka has demanded a trade behind the scenes that we weren't made aware of it even beforehand, let alone at this point in time. And there are also things, I mean, I'll mention a little bit later, but even if Luka demanded a trade, right, you have him for the rest of this season and all of next season before he has a player option. So you have no reason to trade him right now. You have no reason to trade him before this coming off season, or if you wanted to, even wait until the next trade deadline, which is what I would personally advise. This is more like when Anthony Davis was traded to the Lakers, which it's funny, I didn't have him on my list, but I guess he would have actually been a pretty good example too. Another guy going to the Lakers, but Anthony Davis was traded with a full year and a half left on his contract. He was traded at the trade deadline when he could have finished out that season and still played a full one after. Again, Anthony Davis made the second round of the playoffs one time as a Pelican, whereas Luka has won playoff series in two. He's made a conference finals and a finals. I don't know how else to say it. That sort of speaks for itself, right? So in this demanded a trade bucket, I've got 3 guys again. Anthony Davis would have been a good one to bring up, but I guess I brought him up already. Just as an aside. But the first one that I thought of instantly, and I've seen mentioned a lot, is Kareem. Kareem was traded from the Bucks to the Lakers. He was, I think, had played 7 or 8 years for the Bucks. He was 27 years old. He had already won a title for the Bucks and had actually lost a finals as well, Game 7 to the Celtics, I believe 2 years before he was traded. This was after Oscar Robertson had retired. So Milwaukee, the team, had their sort of peaks with Kareem, and this was a bit of a valley that they had fallen into. Kareem had won 3 MVPs already with the Bucks, so obviously he had established himself as an incredible player. He was only 27 years old, which this was not in the era of modern medicine. Kareem is 7'2", so again, there's maybe some. You certainly could have expected him not to be the player he was until age 38, 39. But he was still clearly somebody that had a long road ahead of him and had proven to be able to win you titles and win MVPs. This, however, was a trade demand, and a pretty strong trade demand, one that likely was not going to get rescinded no matter what happened. Kareem was going to hit free agency. He was traded in the offseason, so he was going to be a free agent after one more season. And one of the main reasons, often cited as the main reason that he wanted to trade, was to leave Milwaukee as a city. Milwaukee was a highly segregated city and was frankly just not very accepting of black people. And certainly as a 7'2" black person, I think that Kareem just did not, and as a practicing Muslim, it is very clear in his discussions and people who have talked to him later on that he just was not happy in that city and was frankly not going to be happy in that city. There was nothing that Milwaukee was going to do in that year to convince Kareem that Milwaukee was a different type of city, right? They weren't going to change the city in that one year. So he wanted to go to Los Angeles or New York City. He obviously was traded to LA. He was traded for a package of Elmore Smith, who Elmore is actually an interesting guy because he had 2 pretty good years in Buffalo to start his career. Second in Rookie of the Year and got in at 13th place in the MVP, which it means you got a few votes, probably from Buffalo writers, but still, I always find the Buffalo Braves to be a fascinating team to look at, and Elmore Smith did have a couple of great seasons with them before playing a few with the Lakers, and he actually is the leader in blocks per game for a season when he had 4.9 blocks per game. Not the year before he was traded, but the year prior to that. So he was a good player. Again, nothing compared to Kareem, not an all-star. At no point was he a star or the best player on your team, but he was a solid player. Also traded for Brian Winters, who was coming off of his rookie season and made 2 All-Stars for the Bucks. Also got Junior Bridgman, who is a 9-year rotation player and is now known for being a money savant, having made a lot of money with restaurant franchises after his career, despite, again, being sort of a middling player during his career and not making nearly as much as even a lot of guys during his era. And also Dave Myers, who was a contributor for a few years, got injured, not a particularly relevant player. So that's a pretty bad return. Obviously, we're trading away Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the middle of his prime. But again, he had 1 year left. They weren't going to be able to change the city of Milwaukee. There was even discussion of, again, the GM and the coach offered to more or less fire themselves if that had anything to do with it. There was talk of him living full-time in New York City and coming to Milwaukee to play. But it just was unrealistic, right? Kareem wanted to live in a different city. Milwaukee, again, we saw how Bill Russell was treated by Boston, right? There's a classic story. Classic's not a good way to put it. There's a horrible story about how Boston fans themselves, again, Boston is not necessarily a vibrant, multicultural city in of itself. There's a story about how Celtics fans broke into Bill Russell's home and smeared feces across his bed and his walls. I mean, it's just absolutely disgusting stuff. But again, this was a little bit later in America. This was the 70s, but it still was not a particularly great time to be a black man, and especially not a very tall, distinctive black man. So he just wanted to be in a different city, a city where he could be more comfortable. And there was not a lot Milwaukee could do. Not a great return, but sort of is what it is in this circumstance. The other trade that I wanted to talk about that I thought, again, in this sort of demanded a trade realm, was Dwight Howard. Dwight Howard was he spent 8 years with the Magic. He made the finals with them in 2009. Again, was the first overall pick in his own right in 2005. Dwight, again, people have mentioned this, but he gets a little bit underrated because he had several years where he was kind of floundering, became a bit of a role player, obviously won the title with the Lakers, in which he was a great role player for them. But he was a monster during his time, a phenom during his time. He made 5 straight All-NBA first teams. Sounds familiar. Sounds kind of like what that guy Luka did. But he made 5 straight All-NBA first teams, again, in a somewhat weak center time for centers, the late 2000s, early 2010s. But made those 5 teams right before he was traded. He came in 3rd in Defensive Player of the year before he was traded, or the offseason. The year he was traded in the offseason. So the year prior, he had made 3rd team and won 3 Defensive Player of the Year straight before that. So he was a great defensive player. Nobody really doubted that in his time. He had 1 year left under contract. Again, he was traded in the offseason, similar to Kareem. Very publicly asked to go to LA. There is not really any doubt that he was going to leave the Magic in the upcoming free agency period. And this was a period where free agency had few restrictions on them. It was generally financially viable to leave your incumbent city, even if they were the one that drafted you. There was very little financial incentive that could be given by the Magic, whereas Supermax contracts nowadays and bird rights obviously give you huge reason to stick with your incumbent team. The Lakers ended up trading 2 firsts in Nikola Vucevic to Orlando, which was very much panned at the time and still looks like a pretty bad return in retrospect. Obviously, Dwight did not have the illustrious career that we may have expected, but Dwight, again, with his pedigree at the time, which I'm trying to focus more on the decision making at the time, Dwight was one of the best players in the NBA, probably a top 5 player, maybe even a little bit higher than that. Could have certainly won an MVP or two. Could have been a part of a title team. Again, he was by far the best player on a finals team in 2009. It's is what it is, right? He beat LeBron in his prime. So I think that was a pretty bad return, but again, there wasn't a lot that the Magic were going to do. They waited until the last possible moment. Again, they could have kept him up until the trade deadline, tried to convince him to stay in Orlando, but it was pretty clear that Dwight wanted to go specifically to LA. He was very clear in his demand that he wanted to go to LA. So I think there is a bit of room to say, should they have tried to hold on to him, try to look for different offers. Again, he was probably going to leave in the offseason, but maybe you could have looked at other teams rather than just sending him to LA. But again, pretty mediocre, I would say, a poor return overall. The second guy on this list that got shipped to the Lakers, which is funny. I guess third if we're talking about Anthony Davis as well. So Lakers keep winning, I guess. This third category I have is sort of issues with the team. And this does blend a little bit into trade demands, especially with the second guy I'll talk about. But this is more, there was conflict within the team. Again, there's been some discussion that I don't think it's any surprise that, or a secret that Luka is a bit of a thorny personality. He's probably a bit of a head case to deal with. He's probably a lot to deal with behind the scenes. But it's hard to deny that he does that because it's hard to deny that he cares about winning. And I think that his track record has shown that he's very capable of winning. But I don't think it's any secret that he's difficult to manage behind the scenes. And this is a combination of difficult to manage and probably just some disagreement in terms of the culture, the fit, etc. The first guy I'll go ahead and talk about, again, is Kawhi Leonard. That is a very clear one where the Spurs had their very strong culture of stars aren't what make our team run. Greg Popovich was sort of the star of the franchise, the face of the franchise, especially after Tim Duncan had retired. Tim was never somebody that really wanted to be the face, so I think to an extent Popovich was the face of that franchise. Kawhi obviously, though, had major injury concerns, which we have seen play out, right? He has chronic knee problems that have led to needing load management. They have led to, again, Kawhi was for the trade, right? Kawhi was traded to Toronto for DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a first-round pick. Obviously not a return that was praised at the time, but this was a lot more of a speculative deal than people, I think, give credit to and gave credit to even at the time. DeMar was never going to be a fan. He was never going to be a superstar that led your team to a title, but he was certainly a fan favorite and somebody that was a very good player, albeit on some mediocre teams. Poeltl and a first-round pick are sort of whatever. That's marginal. It's trivial. Kawhi, though, again, he had major knee problems. He had the magical run in 2019 where he was literally limping around the court. I think it's fair to say he probably did some further damage during that playoffs, but I mean, he was phenomenal, right? I don't want to downplay that. That was one of my favorite playoff runs of all time. 2019 playoffs are only second behind the 2016 playoffs in terms of my favorite playoffs that I've watched, which I've been watching consistently since 2013 when the Heat first won their title. 2012 when the Heat won their first title against OKC. So, again, Kawhi, the issues were, some of it was personal. There was the uncle, I don't even remember the guy's name now, but the uncle was sort of stirring up drama. They were trying to guide him back to LA, which Kawhi is from LA. But again, I think the biggest thing was that there were these major knee concerns. And again, like I was trying to get into, he had the magical run in 2019. He had a great run in 2020. Well, great run, I guess, is not the right way to put it. But he was healthy during 2020. And then the last 4 playoffs, he has had to leave because he's had injuries, whether it was re-tearing the ACL or just, again, not even being there for the playoffs in 2023. He has not been able to make it through the last 4 postseasons. So that obviously has played out in not a particularly favorable way for the teams, specifically the Clippers, who have had Kawhi. So that one is kind of tough to evaluate. I would say, obviously, for Toronto, they would do it every single day of the week. to be able to get Kawhi and win a title. But that was a very speculative trade, and I know that Luka has missed some games this season, but I don't think it's nearly the same as looking at Kawhi and the injury problems that he had and has continued to have. Again, those were chronic knee problems that he was dealing with, and it has panned out as such. The next guy I'll talk about is Vince Carter. Vince was 28 years old when he got traded. He was in his 7th year with Toronto. He was shipped to the New Jersey Nets, at the time New Jersey, now the Brooklyn Nets, for a pretty terrible return. They got old, non-functional Alonzo Mourning. They got Aaron Williams and Eric Williams, who are not two guys I'm familiar with, but were absolutely not particularly valuable to the Raptors. And they got 2 first-round picks. So it was a pretty poor return. But this was a special circumstance where Vince tried really hard to tank his value. And again, this one probably should have been in the trade demands one. I put it here because it ended up being such a dramatic, such a long played out experience for both sides. But I do think it is worth talking about Vince in terms of his status as a player. Vince obviously never became the superstar, the MVP, the title winner that he seemed like he might be coming out of college, and especially his first few years in the league. But his first few years in the league, again, were phenomenal. He made 6 straight All-Star teams. He, again, only missing at his rookie year. He made All-NBA his second and third years, making the third team his second year, and the second team in his third year, just to make things more complicated for me to say. But he also got MVP votes in his first 3 years. Never finished above 10th, but he did get a couple of straight MVP votes. Again, you always have to wonder, he's in Toronto, in a small market, were those just Toronto beat writers writing him in? But he was a fantastic player his first several years. And again, for his whole career, he was a really good player. But again, this is a guy that made 6 All-Star teams, was a fan favorite. You can at least say that, right? The fans adored him. His dunk contest, again, the honey pot dunk is one of, I think it's my favorite dunk of all time, at least in the dunk contest itself. But he never really had the success that a guy like Kawhi, or again, Kareem, to be a dramatic example, or to tie it back to what this is all about, Luka. Vince Carter never had success that was comparable to a guy like Luka. Vince made the playoffs only twice during the 7 years that he was there. They missed the playoffs 5 times, and he never made it to the conference finals. They only made it to the second round 1 time when they lost to Allen Iverson in the 76ers in 2001. So that was obviously a situation that got very nasty, with Vince sort of faking injuries and missing games to try to force his way out of Toronto. Toronto was a very new franchise. Toronto had not been run particularly competently at that point. But eventually he was traded, and the Raptors did end up getting Chris Bosh in that upcoming draft. So it wasn't the worst thing for both sides, frankly. But that was one where I think Vince Carter's value and stature as a player, still nothing compared to Luka, but a little bit closer, I would say. The last guy I'm going to talk about as a comparison, and this is the best comparison in my mind. Again, I haven't thought through this nearly as much as the smart folks out there, Kevin Pelton, Bobby Marks, the people who are actually professionals at this. But the guy that really he popped in my mind pretty quickly, and I think is the best comparison that I came up with, was Charles Barkley. Charles Barkley was drafted into Philly. He played there for 8 years. Obviously, his first couple of years were with Dr. J and with Moses Malone. But they left. Irving retired in 87, and Moses was traded in 86. But Barkley had a incredibly strong start to his career in Philly. So Barkley played, again, 8 years there. He made 6 straight All-Star games starting in his 3rd season. Made 4 All-NBA first teams. So again, going back to Luka, Luka had 5 first teams his last 5 years. Again, just outside of his rookie year, he didn't make an All-NBA team. But just to say, they are considered the top of their position and one of the best 5 in the league. That generally means that you are somebody that can lead your team to a title, or at least that's there's a strong correlation there. And you're making it several times in a row. I think there's a very strong correlation there. He also was top 6 in MVP voting 6 straight times. He was, again, starting in his third year, he made it 6th in MVP voting, 6th again, 4th in MVP voting. He was actually 2nd in MVP voting in 1990 when he lost to Magic Johnson. Came in 4th and then in 12th. But again, several high-placing MVP rankings. The 12th is somewhat marginal, but those other ones are all legitimate vote-getting campaigns. Barkley, again, they had a lot of success with Malone and Irving still there, but Barkley had similar playoff struggles, not nearly as much as Vince, but he was unable to take them to the conference finals, them being Philly, by himself. So they only made the second round twice. They got beat 4-1 by the Bulls each time. Again, this was Jordan in his prime. It's tough to avoid Jordan. It's tough to beat Jordan. But they missed the playoffs the year before he got traded in the offseason. So this was an example of a team that was just not able to hit the peaks that they thought they could, missed the playoffs right before they traded Barkley. And of course, Barkley is famous for having a prickly personality. We see him on TV and he's a wonderful guy. He seems to be a very deep character, but he would not deny himself that he was difficult to deal with, and especially in those younger years, especially when you're not even making the playoffs. So that is one where I think it is the most clear personality differences that got him traded. But again, it was a huge steal for the Suns, that's for sure, who the Suns were able to trade for him and make the NBA Finals with him, and had a lot of great success overall, with Kevin Johnson as the point guard and Dan Marley as one of their big forwards, who were both great players. So Barkley was traded for Jeff Hornacek, Jeff Hornacek was 28 years old and just had come off his first All-Star appearance. So Hornacek was a great player and an incredible scorer. Did not end up having a ton of success in Philly. He had some good years, but did not last too long. I think he was around 32 or 33 when he retired, and did not necessarily take them further in the playoffs than Barkley did. Absolutely did not. Also got Andrew Lang and Tim Perry, who are not guys I am familiar with, but they were in the trade as well. So overall, again, a pretty bad trade, and to trade 28-year-old Charles Barkley for that package, it's a pretty awful return, especially, again, this is looking as much as possible at the decision in that moment. And Barkley was, again, one of the top 5 players in the league, as was proven by him having MVP finishes of 6-6, 4-4-2, right? He was consistently year in and year out placing in the top 10 in MVP voting. So I think that's the most similar to Luka in terms of this trade, although I still don't see this. Again, I think that Dwight Howard and Charles Barkley are the two closest in terms of stature in the league and performance, but Barkley never took the Sixers to the conference finals, let alone to the finals. Whereas Luka, again, I'm going to get into Luka's, his stats, the sort of info that I pulled that I think is really relevant, especially in these comparisons. Luka has made the finals and the conference finals. Again, Barkley got traded the year after they missed the playoffs. Luka in the Mavs just made the finals. They just made the finals. They just did it. So Luka, again, is 25 years old. This is his 7th season with the team. He has, other than his rookie year, been All-NBA first team every single time. So he has played 6 seasons and has made first team NBA 5 of those 6 seasons. The one that he didn't make it was his rookie year, in which he was still putting up 20 points a game. He was still a very good player who really came into his own in the second half of that season once Dennis Smith kind of ceded control of the team. It's not very surprising, but his MVP voting, Luka has, since his second year, been placing in the top 10 of MVP voting. He came in 4th, he came in 6th, he came in 5th, 8th, and then last year he came in 3rd in MVP voting. He has made the playoffs every year other than his rookie year. He has made the playoffs every time other than his rookie year in the year 2023, in which his team actively tanked out of the playoffs against his own wishes. And that was after they semi-tanked their own season by trading for Kyrie and having a terrible melting period. again, I think that was a good trade. I think that in retrospect, obviously, it led to the finals appearance the next year. But it is worth noting that Luka only missed the playoffs when he was a rookie, playing with Dennis Smith Jr. as his other his second best player, and like 39-year-old Dirk, and then the season where his team traded for Kyrie in the middle of it, lost a bunch of games, and then actively lost. Mark Cuban got fined because they actively tanked to stay out of the playoffs against Luka's wishes. So, again, to go detailed through his playoff performances, in 2020, his second year in the league and his first year in the playoffs, that was the bubble year. They lost to the title favorite Clippers. Again, I know the Clippers went on to have an embarrassing collapse of the Nuggets, but the Clippers were a great team that year, and they were absolutely the title favorites in a lot of people's eyes. This was PG and Kawhi's first year together. Kawhi was healthy and playing great. Luka, again, took them to 6 games. They lost in 6 in the first round, but this was against a great Clippers team, and he personally put up 42 points, 43 points, and 38 points against Paul George and Kawhi Leonard in his second year in the NBA in his first postseason series. His second playoff appearance, 2021, lost again to the Clippers, another great Clippers team. Kawhi's last great playoff performance was keeping them from getting eliminated by the Mavericks. He had that, I think, 42-point game in Game 6. The Mavericks were up 3-2, and Kawhi saved them, helped them win Game 6, and then I think he got injured in that one, but they won Game 7 as well, eliminated the Mavericks. Again, that was the only Clippers team ever to make the conference finals. That was Kawhi's last great playoff series, and they still took him to 7 games. 2022, Luka's 4th season in the league and his third playoff season in the playoffs. First round, they beat the Utah Jazz, who had just been the number 1 seed the previous year and had a very established core of Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. They lost to the Utah team. The Mavs beat Utah in 6 games. They beat them so bad that they broke up the team, trading Rudy Gobert that offseason and trading Donovan Mitchell the next year. So he beat a team so bad that they broke up a potential title contender who had just the previous season been the number 1 overall seed in the entire playoffs. Then he went on to beat the actual number 1 overall seed in that year's playoffs, the 2022 playoffs. He beat Phoenix, who again had won 64 games that year and had made the finals the previous year, losing to the Bucks in 6 games. He broke this team too. So he broke 2 straight teams. The Suns lost so badly and in such an embarrassing fashion in Game 7 especially to Luka, and again, it was Luka and his ragtag team of Maxi Kleber, Dwight Powell, and Trey Burke, right? I mean, this was not an incredible team that Luka was leading. They shipped out DeAndre Ayton, the Suns did, that next offseason because he broke down so badly. They ended up breaking up the entire team other than Devin Booker. They shipped off Chris Paul. They sent out Mikal Bridges to get Kevin Durant. And now they've got a team built around Kevin Durant and Bradley Beal and Devin Booker. A completely different team than the 64-win team because Luka humiliated them, embarrassed them as the number 1 overall seed. This was so bad that he turned Chris Paul into a meme. This was where the Chris Paul hits a clutch shot to bring the team within 42 points meme came from. He humiliated that team. He embarrassed them on their home floor in Game 7. And then eventually they lost to the Warriors, who went on to win the championship in their last great title run. So again, you see a trend of Luka breaking up teams because he humiliates them so badly and losing to teams. So again, the Clippers in their first time together, and the Clippers in Kawhi's last great playoff series, his last healthy playoff series, and then again to the Warriors in their 2022 championship year when they had a magical run and put it all together with a last great hurrah for a top 10 NBA player of all time, Steph Curry, in one of the great cores of all time with that Warriors core of Steph, Clay, and Draymond. So he loses to all-time great teams is what he does. Clippers being an all-time great team is an exaggeration, but still. This example, the 2022 team, there's no shame in losing to that Warriors team. They were hot. And again, Luka had just carried his team through 13 games against teams that were frankly probably better than his. Certainly the supporting casts, you look 2 through 15 on that roster, not even in comparison, the Mavericks versus the Suns or even the Jazz. So loses in the conference finals in 2022. That's further than Barkley ever got. That's further than Vince Carter ever got. And this was within, 4, 5 years? Next year, 2023, the team actively tanks out of the play-in after, again, somewhat throwing away the season with Kyrie. Don't forget, this was the year where the Lakers made the conference finals from the play-in, and the Heat made the finals, the NBA finals, from the play-in game. So to act like this was a nothing, like this didn't matter, that the Mavericks had no chance to get out of the play-in, well, 2 of the conference finals teams were play-in teams, and half the finals was made up of play-in teams. So I think that Luka certainly had a chance of doing something that year. And in this past year, again, I don't need to keep harping on this, but he made the finals last year. He took the Mavericks to the finals. Kyrie's a great player. PJ Washington had an awesome season. Derek Lively had an amazing postseason. I love Derek Lively. But he took a team with Derrick Jones Jr. and PJ Washington to the finals. They beat the Clippers so bad that they broke up the team. PG got shipped off. Russ got shipped off. Again, he breaks up teams left and right. He beat OKC, the team who might win the title this year. And again, they had an incredible series last year. That was a great team, OKC was. And beat Minnesota, who had just beaten the champion from the previous season in Denver. They lost to the Celtics. That was a bad series. Luka did not have a great showing personally. He had that game where he got ejected with 6 fouls with like 5 minutes left. I think it was game 3, which I was furious about. I thought that was a horrible performance by him. But again, he was the only reason they were there in the first place, and the only reason they had a chance of winning that game to begin with. Lost to the 64-win Celtics, who frankly maybe have the greatest starting lineup of all time in terms of pure talent, and are one of the great teams of this century, no doubt. So he has, in his playoff career, made a conference finals, and then lost twice in competitive series to really good Clippers teams. And he's in his 7th season. So clearly they didn't trade Luka because he hadn't been successful. I mean, he was by far the best player on each of these teams. Kyrie is the only time he's had a guy that was even reasonable as the second best player. Spencer Dinwiddie was maybe the second best player on his conference finals run. So he's clearly shown that he can win, and he can win in a lot of different contexts, and he can win in the playoffs. He's one of the few players that stats get better in the playoffs than in the regular season. So is it a money thing? Was Luka going to leave in the offseason? Well, Luka's still got this season and one more after this. So even if the Mavericks thought he was going to leave in free agency, which is very unlikely, they could have waited until this offseason. He's under contract for next season and then has a player option, which, again, he'll probably decline that, looking for an extension off of this current contract. But why not wait one more year? Why not wait until the offseason? Or, again, you could wait until next year's trade deadline. Players generally are going to expect to sign an extension with the teams they get traded to. So I don't think there's really any risk in waiting until the trade deadline. A team that trades for him is not trading for him for a rental. They're expecting to keep him long term. I don't think the Lakers are expecting him to leave in 2026, right? I think that's very unlikely that he will. Players are very heavily incentivized to stay with the teams that they are signed with. Because of LeBron, because of KD leaving free agency, the designated player rule at Supermax has all been geared towards keeping players with their teams. They're trying to keep guys in small markets. Like Luka again, Dallas is not a small city, but compared to LA, it is. So, okay, well, is Luka not particularly popular? Is that what it is? I don't think anyone's arguing that. Luka's one of the most exciting players in the league. He draws the most headlines. His highlight tapes are, I mean, compared to Anthony Davis, right? Who's watching Anthony Davis highlights as opposed to Luka highlights? One stat I pulled just, again, I don't need to go too much further on this. I've talked plenty, but Luka, in terms of popularity, or in translating popularity into money, right? Jersey sales the last few years. Last year, 2024, 6th in jersey sales. 2023, 5th in jersey sales. 22, 8th in jersey sales. 21, 4th in jersey sales. 2020, 2nd in jersey sales. His rookie year, 2019, he was 13th in jersey sales. So I don't think they're struggling to make money off of him. It's not like Luka's not an incredibly popular player that's not in line with his status as a, in terms of his skill as a player. His popularity certainly matches up with that. So what happened here? I can't explain it personally. It doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't think this is a unique sentiment, right? I'm not special for this, but I mean, I think it's reasonable to call into question whether this is one of the worst NBA trades of all time, one of the worst sports trades of all time, and certainly has a chance to be the worst of all time. I think this might be the player with the most potential to win MVPs, plural, and titles, plural, that has ever been traded. Again, if you want to talk about LeBron, he was technically traded when he went to the Heat. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about free agency moves. And even talking about those guys that were traded when they demanded a trade, right? I think Kareem, you would obviously look to as a greater player. Kareem would be the one I would point to. Bill Russell, again, popped up on this list. He was traded as a draft pick. Those two guys, with Bill Russell maybe being an exception because Bill Russell had not played in the NBA yet. Again, he was established as clearly looking to be a potential... He looked like he might be the best basketball player that had ever existed at that point, and I think it's fair to say Bill Russell during his time was the greatest basketball player of all time. Up until Kareem, he was the undisputed GOAT. But Luka is one of the... He might be the third greatest NBA player of all time that's been traded, at least at the time he was traded. He's made 5 straight All-NBA first teams. He just took a team to the finals as the undisputed best player, took a team to the conference finals as the undisputed best player, where Spencer Dinwiddie was his running mate. I mean, he's been top 10 in MVP voting each year, just finished 3rd in MVP voting, looks like a clear candidate to win MVPs. I'm going to say it again, I think he's a clear candidate to win titles going forward with the Mavericks, not looking ahead to the Lakers, but with the Mavericks. If you were going to say over the next 10 years, tell me the team's most likely to win a title, I would put the Mavericks at the top of that list. Because who else are you looking at? Sorry, I take that back. I would put OKC number 1, and then I would put Dallas number 2. Because OKC has Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and Luka is with the Mavs, right? Denver would be up there. The Bucks would be up there because they have Jokic and they have Giannis. But I don't know what to tell you. Like I think this is... I mean, I have some other stuff now. It's mostly just jokes. I think this is ridiculous. I think the Mavericks should be looked into in a federal investigation. I think that this should come with criminal charges. I think that this is an absolute miscarriage of your duties as the ownership and as the general managers of the Dallas Mavericks, right? Obviously, Nico Harrison didn't wake up one day and say, we should trade Luka, right? Obviously, this had to come from ownership. I think that the biggest question to be answered going forward is who in this organization thought this made sense, right? Was it Miriam Adelson? Was it the new ownership, right? Who within that group decided this was a good idea? I guarantee you Nico Harrison didn't just decide to do it and come to the ownership, right? He's clearly the fall guy for this. But I'm telling you right now, if I was the general manager and you came to me and said, trade Luka or you're fired, you're firing me. I'm not doing that. I'm not making my reputation as a professional in the league that I'm the guy that traded Luka Doncic at age 25 after making 5 straight All-Star teams. Because he missed a few games? Are you kidding me? This is not a guy with chronic injury problems. He's not a guy that's had injury problems in the playoffs. That's not the case. Did Adam Silver make a call? The rating's too low, so he said, "Hey, we need some more drama." Is Luka? Did he murder somebody? Is he about to get a murder charge? Is he going to go back and play in the EuroLeague or something? Am I missing something? I mean, there's clearly something going on that we're not aware of, or things going on, right? This whole idea of he's out of shape and he's injury prone is ridiculous. That means nothing to me when he just took you to the finals last year. And again, has consistently been a great player, and a great player in the playoffs, too. You just built a team around him that you think can make the finals. You know why you think that? Because they just made the finals. This is not the time to trade Luka. If you were going to trade Luka out of some panic thing, why wouldn't you do it in 2023 after you missed the playoffs? The thing that I always come back to is, how did this not leak? Because there's a couple of things, right? How long did this process take? And how many teams in the Mavs negotiate with? Because you would expect if they took months and months of negotiation with several teams, it would have gotten leaked. That's how the league works. And frankly, teams that didn't get Luka would want to stir the pot and leak it if they had a chance to negotiate and were rejected, right? If they knew they didn't have a chance, that information would have gotten out there. Did they negotiate to try to get Jokic or Giannis or Paolo from the Magic with 5 extra first-round picks? Or John Morant with 5 extra first-round picks? Did they try to get Zion and 10 first-round picks? Again, I think that going through this exercise, I did have to take a step back and realize, okay, Anthony Davis is absolutely the best player on this list of returns, right? I mean, Charles Barkley, we're talking about Jeff Hornacek. I mean, Jeff Hornacek ain't Anthony Davis. Like, don't get it wrong. Anthony Davis is one of the best players that's been traded in his own right. It's very difficult to imagine that this is a worthwhile trade given the risk that you're taking on and what Luka's going to do in the future. And it's also hard to imagine, again, as good as Anthony Davis is, he's 30 and injury prone and can't, he's maybe the 20th best lead option on a team, right? Is Kyrie going to be your lead option? Because he's also around the 20th best at that. They're both great complementary players, but they're not suited to be the lead option on a strong playoff contender, let alone a championship contender. I just think that if this was going to happen, it should have been a long, drawn-out, painful process for both sides. It should have required Luka making trade demand after trade demand. They should have looked like the Heat with Jimmy Butler, right? This should have been painful, because it is painful. You just lost the second best player in your franchise. This dude could have taken over as the greatest player in your franchise, which I'm not saying that to blaspheme Dirk. Dirk is one of the 15 to 20 greatest players of all time. He's got a statue out in front of that stadium for a reason. Luka could have been better than him. Luka could have won you multiple titles. I don't know what to tell you. He's an incredible player who's already proven. This isn't Zion. This isn't speculative, right? This is not Cooper Flagg we're talking about. This isn't even Wembanyama we're talking about. Wembanyama hasn't won in the playoffs once. Luka just made the finals with the team that you built around him, and now you're shipping him off for Anthony Davis? Again, really good player, but he's 30 years old, and he's not going to win you a title with this group, right? Unless you think Kyrie is some incredible playmaker and is going to be the top guy and is going to be the leader for your team, which Kyrie's had a great last couple of years in terms of his play and his mental fortitude, but that guy ain't going to be the leader of my team. I don't know what to tell you, right? I think that part of the reason he's fallen into the comfortable place he has is because he had Luka to take the pressure off him in terms of being a leader and being the main creator on his team. I just think that, why was this so clean and simple, right? Why was it such a shock? I think if this was going to happen, it should have been after a long, drawn-out process with months of negotiation with different teams and leveraging teams against each other. It just seems to me like the Mavs thought, again, there has to be some amount of exaggeration with, oh, well, Anthony Davis was our guy. We just wanted him so bad. But clearly, to an extent, they did. They approached the Lakers, it sounds like. Why weren't they taking bids? Why weren't they working to try to get Giannis? You don't think you could have gotten Giannis for Luka? I think you could have. Could you get Jokic for Luka? Maybe. Get De'Aaron Fox for Luka. You absolutely could have done that. I mean, you could have got De'Aaron Fox, Keegan Murray, 3 first-round picks, 5 first-round picks for Luka. I just think it's unfathomable that this was the best deal that the Mavericks could get. Not even considering whether they should have done this at all. There's no way this was the best deal they could get. And there's no way they spent enough time and did enough diligence with their negotiations. Because if they did, it would have leaked. And we would have been aware of it. And again, I think that the strategy should have been, you want to trade, brother? Again, even assuming he demanded a trade, which almost had to have happened, because why else would you do this? You should have forced him to make it public. You should have forced him to play through games, or force him to sit out and fake injuries or whatever. Make it as painful as possible, because you know what's going to be really painful? Spending the next 5 to 10 years floundering and watching Luka on the Lakers win titles. That's going to be painful. So, again, I've gone on too long about this. I'm not some professional. I'm not an expert, but this just seems like the greatest miscarriage of the worst shepherding of a team that I've ever seen. I think this is the worst trade of NBA history. Again, given the decision making at the time, this may be the worst trade in sports history. You'd have to look at, again, I was talking with my dad about this earlier. Babe Ruth from the Sox to the Yankees. That might be the only other one you can consider. And you know what? Babe Ruth wasn't making first teams. I don't need to get into that. That's ridiculous. But yeah, there's not much else to say. Praying for you, Mavericks fans. I can't believe the Lakers got away with it again, but so be it. Yeah, that's about all I've got. See how this play. You know what? I'll certainly be watching some Lakers games. I will be watching some Lakers games now. So, yeah. Thanks y'all for tuning in, I guess.